What if a single day in history was seen not only as a political event, but as the fulfillment of ancient prophecy? On November 2nd, 1930, Rastafari Makonnen was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. To some, it was the rise of a modern African monarch. To others, it was the long-awaited fulfillment of a divine promise echoed through scripture and song. This video explores the extraordinary coronation of Haile Selassie I, a moment deeply rooted in both historical reality and spiritual symbolism. From the sacred rituals performed in the heart of Addis Ababa to the global ripple effect that followed, this was more than a national ceremony. It marked a turning point for Ethiopia, for Africa, and for millions who would come to see in Selassie the living embodiment of messianic hope. We'll examine the path that led to this event, the prophetic language woven into the coronation, and how this moment helped give rise to a global movement, Rastafari, that forever linked his reign to biblical destiny. The coronation of Haile Selassie I stands not only as a defining moment in Ethiopian history, but as a symbol of black sovereignty, divine kingship, and fulfillment of prophecy. This is the story of that day, and why it still matters nearly a century later. Long before Haile Selassie I ascended the throne, Ethiopia stood apart as a symbol of enduring African sovereignty. Unlike much of the continent, Ethiopia had resisted European colonization, defeating Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, a rare and powerful moment of African victory during the height of imperial expansion. This victory not only preserved Ethiopia's independence, but reinforced its mythic stature as an ancient kingdom protected by divine providence. The Ethiopian monarchy traced its lineage back thousands of years, with legends claiming descent from King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba. This sacred genealogy gave Ethiopia's rulers a unique spiritual and historical legitimacy, one rooted in biblical tradition and national pride. Within this tradition, the idea of a divinely appointed king was more than ceremonial. It was believed to be prophetic. By the early 20th century, Rastafari Makonnen had emerged as a central figure in Ethiopian politics. Born in 1892 into a noble family with deep political ties, Tafari was known for his intellect, diplomatic skill, and modernist vision. Under Emperor Menelik II and later Empress Zuda II, he gradually rose in power, first as governor of Harar, then as crown prince and regent plenipotentiary. By the 1920s, he effectively ruled the country, advocating for modernization while carefully preserving Ethiopia's sovereignty. Globally, the backdrop was one of colonial domination across Africa. European powers had carved up the continent, and black resistance movements struggled under foreign rule. In this context, Ethiopia became more than a nation, it was a beacon. For many in the diaspora, it symbolized resilience, dignity, and the possibility of self-rule. Tafari's rise was watched closely, especially by those seeking signs of change or deliverance. As the 1930s approached, the world stood at a crossroads. And so did Ethiopia. On the morning of November 2nd, 1930, the city of Addis Ababa awoke to a sight unlike any it had witnessed in its history. Streets were filled with banners, processions, and dignitaries. The sacred grounds of the Cathedral of St. George, a historic Ethiopian Orthodox site, had been prepared for a ceremony that would blend imperial grandeur with ancient spiritual symbolism. This was the coronation of Rastafari Makonnen as Emperor Haile Selassie I, a moment designed not only to impress the world, but to echo deeply within the traditions of Ethiopia's divine monarchy. The ceremony was conducted by Abuna Kyrillos, the head of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, in strict accordance with religious and royal custom. Before the coronation, Tafari spent the night in prayer and fasting. Early in the morning, he proceeded from the royal palace in a grand procession, robed in ceremonial garments inspired by Ethiopian imperial and biblical imagery. He wore a golden crown, an ermine-trimmed crimson robe, and carried a golden orb and scepter, symbols of authority and divine right. Inside the cathedral, in front of clergy, nobles, and a global audience, Tafari received 7 anointings on his head, brow, shoulders, hands, and feet, each representing a spiritual mantle of leadership. He was crowned not merely as king, but with a title heavy with religious and historical weight. Haile Selassie I, elect of God, King of kings, Lord of lords, conquering lion of the tribe of Judah. These were not idle words. They were phrases taken from biblical scripture, particularly the book of Revelation, often used to describe the returned Messiah. In the eyes of the Ethiopian Church and many across the African diaspora, the use of such titles suggested divine appointment and messianic significance. The coronation was remarkable not only for its ritual power, but for its international presence. Delegations came from all corners of the globe, including representatives from the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Germany, Egypt, Turkey, and Japan. Foreign press were invited to document the occasion, and the coronation became a rare global media event focused on a black sovereign at a time when most of Africa was under colonial rule. The presence of Western diplomats and journalists helped to amplify the significance of the ceremony beyond Ethiopia's borders. Newspapers described the event with awe, noting the blend of ancient Christian ritual with imperial elegance. The New York Times reported it as a fusion of Old Testament splendor and modern statecraft. For Ethiopia, this was a chance to assert itself as an ancient and independent empire with a modern vision. For the broader African world, it was a moment of pride, a sign that sovereignty, dignity, and tradition could endure against the tide of imperialism. But the spiritual resonance of the event extended even further. The imagery of the lion, the invocation of prophecy, and the solemnity of the ritual spoke to more than political authority. It echoed promises of redemption and divine justice long awaited by the oppressed. In Jamaica and across the African diaspora, those who followed the teachings of Marcus Garvey saw in this coronation a fulfillment of his famous prophecy. Look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand. Haile Selassie's coronation was therefore more than a national event. It was a moment where history, faith, and identity converged. The ceremony declared the birth of a new era, not just for Ethiopia, but for all those who saw in him a symbol of hope, strength, and spiritual restoration. To many observers, Haile Selassie's coronation in 1930 was a grand display of royal tradition. But to a growing number across the African diaspora, it carried a much deeper meaning, one rooted in prophecy, scripture, and divine identity. Central to this belief was the connection to the Book of Revelation, particularly chapter 5, verse 5, which speaks of the emergence of a figure described as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who is worthy to open the sealed scroll. This title, invoked at Selassie's coronation, was not symbolic to all. For some, it signaled the arrival of a long-anticipated messianic figure. Revelation 19 verse 16 further reinforced this interpretation, referring to a returning king upon whose robe is written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. When Selassie was crowned with these very titles, it was not seen as coincidence. It was seen as confirmation. Ethiopia's royal family had long claimed descent from King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, a lineage said to be preserved through their son Menelik I, founder of the Solomonic dynasty. This tradition was more than folklore. It was a cornerstone of Ethiopian imperial legitimacy. The belief that the Davidic line continued unbroken in Africa gave Haile Selassie a unique spiritual status. In a world where African people had been stripped of history, identity, and sovereignty, the idea that a black king could sit on the throne of David resonated powerfully. The timing of the coronation also added to its prophetic weight. In the early 20th century, Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born black nationalist and Pan-Africanist, had risen to prominence with a message of pride, unity, and return to Africa. One of his most quoted declarations was, "Look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand." Though there is debate about whether Garvey uttered those exact words, the phrase became widely circulated among his followers. When Haile Selassie was crowned, many believed Garvey's prophecy had come to pass. For these believers, Selassie was not just a monarch, he was divine. This perspective laid the foundation for what would become the Rastafari movement, which emerged in Jamaica in the early 1930s. Early Rastafari preachers identified Selassie as the living God, the returned Christ, the fulfillment of both Old and New Testament prophecy. In their eyes, his coronation was a moment of cosmic significance, proof that black redemption and spiritual authority had manifested on earth. Ethiopia itself held a unique place in biblical tradition. Frequently referenced in Scripture as a land of strength and mystery, it was described as a nation that would one day stretch forth its hands unto God. The survival of Ethiopia through centuries of foreign pressure was, to many, proof of divine protection. The coronation of a king who carried both ancient lineage and prophetic titles only affirmed its spiritual destiny. In this context, the event of November 2, 1930 transcended national importance. It became a signal that long-held promises of liberation, identity, and divine rulership were beginning to unfold in real time. The coronation of Haile Selassie I in 1930 sent waves far beyond the borders of Ethiopia. Nowhere was the impact more profound than in Jamaica, where it sparked a movement that fused spiritual revival, political consciousness, and cultural identity. This movement would come to be known as Rastafari. In the impoverished communities of Kingston and the Jamaican countryside, the news of a black king crowned in Africa resonated with extraordinary power. At a time when Jamaica remained under British colonial rule and racism and poverty shaped the daily lives of the African-descended majority, the idea of a sovereign black monarch was revolutionary. It suggested the restoration of dignity and the beginning of divine deliverance. Among the first to interpret Selassie's coronation as the fulfillment of prophecy was Leonard Howell, a charismatic preacher and activist who would become one of the founding fathers of the Rastafari movement. Along with other early figures like Joseph Hibbert, Archibald Dunkley, and Robert Hines, Howell began to teach that Haile Selassie I was not merely a political ruler, but the Messiah, the returned Christ, and the living God. This was a radical reinterpretation of Christian theology through the lens of black identity and liberation. Howell's pamphlet, The Promised Key, declared that the God of the Bible had returned in the form of Haile Selassie. The movement he inspired rejected Western colonialism, condemned white supremacy, and called for a spiritual and cultural return to Africa, which they viewed as Zion. Rastafari became a call to awaken from mental slavery and embrace an African-centered worldview. Central to Rastafari belief was the spiritual symbolism of Selassie's identity. His coronation titles, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, were taken as literal proof of his divinity. These titles, found in the Book of Revelation, were seen as signs that Christ had returned in the flesh. Selassie, believed to be of Solomonic descent, was viewed as the embodiment of righteousness and justice, sent to liberate the oppressed. Rastafari was not only spiritual, it was deeply political. It challenged colonial systems, rejected European standards of culture and religion, and asserted a proud black identity rooted in African heritage. Over time, dreadlocks, Ital food, the use of spiritual herb, ganja, and reggae music would become visible expressions of this movement. But at its heart was a profound reverence for Haile Selassie as divine king and liberator. Though often misunderstood and persecuted in its early years, the Rastafari movement continued to grow. It would later reach global recognition through music, especially in the 1970s, but its foundation was laid in the belief that Selassie's coronation marked the beginning of a new era of spiritual awakening and black liberation. The coronation of Haile Selassie I in 1930 was not merely a historical event, it became a lasting symbol with deep global implications. As the only African emperor recognized on the world stage during an era dominated by colonial rule, Selassie's reign embodied a powerful message of sovereignty, resistance, and dignity. For the Pan-African movement, Selassie emerged as a living example of black leadership in its highest form. He was a visible counterpoint to the prevailing narrative of African inferiority promoted by colonial powers. His active role in international diplomacy, including Ethiopia's membership in the League of Nations and later the United Nations, positioned him as a global statesman committed to African unity and self-determination. During the rise of civil rights and anti-colonial movements, Selassie became a figure of inspiration. His 1936 speech to the League of Nations, delivered after the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, warned the world about the dangers of fascism and imperial aggression. His plea for justice echoed across the globe and later became an anthem of resistance. That same speech would later be immortalized in music, most famously by Bob Marley in the song War. The Rastafari movement, which emerged from the coronation, continued to grow throughout the 20th century, spreading far beyond Jamaica to Africa, Europe, and the Americas. For its followers, Selassie remained a living symbol of black divinity and African identity. His image, words, and legacy continue to serve as spiritual and political inspiration. Selassie's reign also influenced African leaders who sought to liberate the continent. As one of the founding figures of the Organization of African Unity, he championed independence and unity among African states. His vision of a free and united Africa helped shape the post-colonial era. Today, nearly a century after his coronation, the legacy of Haile Selassie remains vital. It lives in the ongoing struggle for justice, in the celebration of African heritage, and in the spiritual devotion of those who still see his crowning as the fulfillment of prophecy and the embodiment of liberation. Nearly a century has passed since Haile Selassie was crowned in Addis Ababa, yet the echoes of that day still resonate. His coronation was more than a political ceremony. It became a symbol of resilience, prophecy, and Black sovereignty. It marked a moment when ancient traditions stood firm against modern oppression, and when a crown placed on an African head sparked a global spiritual awakening. The legacy of that day lives on in multiple dimensions. For some, it remains a cornerstone of faith, a sign of divine presence in human history. For others, it is a source of cultural pride and political identity, a reminder that African leadership and dignity cannot be erased or diminished by colonial narratives. The man crowned King of Kings came to embody a vision of leadership that was moral, visionary, and deeply rooted in heritage. Prophecy, whether spiritual or symbolic, carries power not just in what it foretells, but in what it inspires. Haile Selassie's life and coronation stirred people across the world to reimagine their place in history, to reclaim identity, and to believe in the possibility of restoration. As he once said, history teaches us that unity is strength. That message, like his crown, endures. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the coronation of Haile Selassie I and its lasting significance. If you found this video insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more historical and spiritual explorations. Stay tuned for upcoming videos on Ethiopian history, African heritage, and the global impact of Rastafari. Join the conversation below and let us know what moment in history inspires you most.